Welcome everybody to this second Digital Europe deep dive. This time it's all about standardization, and we have called the event a Standardization Strategy for a Global Europe. Why? Because this is all about how we can create a European standardization strategy, but also how we can collaborate with our like-minded partners and lead on digital standards. How can we work together on standards on artificial intelligence, connectivity, and other subjects? So, speaking of which, I'm very, very sorry that I cannot be there today. I'm actually in Washington, where we will meet with policymakers and stakeholders to align exactly on how we design the future digital standards, the future digital governance of the world. Standards is also really what makes our harmonized internal market in EU possible. It actually turns regulation and legislation into practical criteria so we can implement it in one way across Europe and through collaboration with our partners in one way possibly over the whole globe. We now have many different regulations coming out of the European Commission. Let's just take an example, the AI Act. Well, one thing is making a text in Brussels. Another thing is to actually turn it into practical criteria. Here, we need governments, all kinds of stakeholders, and not least industry to tap in, to interpret that legislation and make it into standards. So, this has only just begun. And this is why we really encourage a collaboration across Europe, but also with our like-minded partners. And European standards are crucial here. This is actually the language of the engineers, of the developers of artificial intelligence. They need that to basically create safe and robust developments and innovations. And it enables the SMEs in Denmark, Germany, Greece to implement it in exactly the same way and use this innovation across the borders. It has been a long way from the Commission's high-level expert group on artificial intelligence until this point where we are discussing how to make these thoughts into real practical requirements. And I am glad that Digital Europe is a part of that discussion in getting exactly the details right also. But we also have to remember that we are not alone in this. Actually, 86% of the growth of European companies comes outside Europe. And not least, US being our biggest trading partner. It is very important that we collaborate and that we actually speak the same language. Setting the standards of the future will determine how successful our societies are in creating innovative market inventions and the future of technology. And even though EU and US do not have the same laws and regulations, we have to a high degree the same values and principles, and everybody benefits from that collaboration. Not least in the TTC, but also with like-minded partners like Japan and others. In February, the European Commission published their new Standardization Strategy, and it aims to put Europe in the lead. So today we will discuss, will this new strategy put us ahead? Will it lead to a faster market adoption of great technologies? Will we become more competitive, more innovative? Is it the right direction? These are all things that we want to discuss today. And let's have a real discussion. Let's find all the views at the table, and let's make sure that in the end, this strategy leads to one thing: more and better innovations, and Europe and like-minded partners being ahead of the curve. So first of all, I want to thank all our guests today. I'm really, really glad that we get to this discussion up front on how the strategy is turned into real standards. And second, of course, I want to thank my team, Jochen, and not least Martin, who's going to facilitate this event. Thank you so much for driving this event and for really making sure that we are doing the thought leadership in standardization. Have a really good discussion.
Thank you, Cecilia, and good luck with your trip to Washington, DC. So my name is Martin Chapman. I'm Digital Europe's Director of Technical Policy and Standards. I'll be moderating today's deep dive on a standardization strategy for a global Europe. So just some housekeeping. Before proceeding, I'd like to inform you that the session is being recorded and it will be posted online to YouTube later for future reference. If you do not consent to this, then please leave now. I hope our panelists do not take this opportunity to escape. You'll also notice in Zoom, we have both the chat function, the Q&A function. I kindly request that if you have a question to one of the panelists, that you use the Q&A feature as this is being monitored, though feel free to use the chat for side discussions. For those that don't know us, Digital Europe is the leading trade association representing digitally transforming industries in Europe. We stand for a regulatory environment that enables European businesses and citizens to prosper from digital technologies. We wish Europe to grow, attract and sustain the world's best digital talents and technology companies. Our membership represents over 36,000 businesses who operate and invest in Europe. It includes 97 corporations, which are global leaders in their field, as well as 41 national trade associations from across Europe. Interestingly, we had one new national trade association join today, so the number went up from 40 to 41 overnight, so that's good news. In February 2022, the European Commission published an EU strategy on standardization around setting global standards in support of a resilient, green and digital EU markets, the so-called twin transition. The strategy contained a number of components and actions, and today we will explore the implications of this strategy both on the EU single market and its impact on international trade, how this strategy can help the new regulatory areas such as artificial intelligence, and then whether this strategy supports the ambitions for better collaboration with like-minded international partners, in particular in the context of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, the TTC. To help us, we are joined by a panel of very impressive experts from both sides of the Atlantic. They represent both a combination of legislative representatives, trade and industry viewpoints. So we have a good cross-section. So here, and this will be the order of the speakers as well, we have Gwenole Cozigou, who's Director of Industrial Transformation and Advanced Value Chains with DG GROW in the European Commission. We have MEP Catharina Rinzema, Member of the European Parliament Delegation for Relations with the United States, clearly from the European Parliament. Anthony Quinn, the Standards Team Lead, Office of Standards and Intellectual Property, the US Department of Commerce's International Trade Association. Then we have Dirk Weiler, who is the Board Chair of ETSI, also the Head of Standards Policy for Nokia and a Digital Europe member. Then we have Rebekka Porath, who's Director Standards Policy for EMEA for Intel. Rebekka is Vice Chair of the Digital Europe Working Group on Standards and Interoperability. And this is the group that has been responsible for this presentation and also for our responses to the consultations. And then finally, and last but not least, we have Jelle Hoedemaekers, who's an expert in ICT standardization from Agoria. Agoria is the National Trade Association, or a National Trade Association in Belgium, and also a Digital Europe member. So in terms of format, I will first give the floor to Mr. Cozigou, who will give a brief overview of the strategy. I will then present an overview of Digital Europe's feedback, and then I'll invite the other panelists, starting with MEP Rinzema, to add their views and Eurosense. I'm aware that MEP Rinzema has a time constraint, so I will ask her one question after her presentation, and then we'll go into the Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Gwenole Cozigou from the European Commission to take the floor.
Thank you, Martin, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for the invitation. So what I think is would make sense is that I present to you what we wanted to do with strategy and what the main elements of it are on that basis. Basically, before I jump into the strategy itself that was adopted beginning of February, I think I have to explain what our thoughts were when working on it, developing it. The first element we were conscious of is that, of course, standards are highly technical, but they are not only technical. They are also highly strategic. And this is a dimension that might not have been taken into consideration strongly enough, including by our decision makers in the past. So they are quite technical, they are quite complex, but they're extremely important. They affect a very wide-ranging portfolio, a bit from consumer safety, connected devices, energy efficiency, plastics recycling, you name it. Whatever subject you touch, you need standards. And the best legislation, the best policy is often toothless if we don't have standards that ensure that products are safe, that they're interoperable, or that they reach global markets. So that's the first thing, the reaffirmation or the affirmation, because it had been a very long time this affirmation had not been done, that standards are essential. The second reflection we had is that, of course, we're operating in the global context, and it's welcome. But we also, by experience, know that if we don't move first, we basically are obliged to follow others, and our companies can find themselves at a competitive disadvantage. And that's the same for standards. If we don't deliver on standards, our big industrial ambitions, be it clean hydrogen, being microchip products, etc., will fall short of delivering. And another element, which is for us extremely important, is that we want to protect our democratic values. And they would be at risk if we don't accompany the standards development process more proactively and make sure that standards correspond to our values. For too long, the strategic importance of standards has been neglected, and we do not want to lose our international footprint in key strategic areas. And we're quite happy that the Europeans have been playing a very active role and quite important role in international standardization, but we want our influence to continue to be present. And we see that partners, or certain partners, are becoming more active, more assertive, for instance, China. That can be seen just by reading the Chinese National Standardization Strategy that was issued a few months ago. So, I mean, we have to be conscious, not blind, of developments on the global scene. And those are some of the reasons, or some thinking we had when before the Commission adopted the Standardization Strategy beginning of February. It's a package, actually. I mean, you've got a first translation of what we want to do with the new annual union work program. You've also got a legal amendment on which we can come back later on, of a standardization regulation. And of course, something which is more of a sort of obligation of reporting on the implementation of the regulation. So there were 4 elements, and those are the 4. On the strategy, concretely, what are the work strands? We've got 5. The first one, we want to gear the European standardization system towards delivery, more anticipation, more prioritization, faster timelines. And here we're clear about standardization urgencies, COVID, vaccines and medicines, microchips, raw materials, hydrogen, where we need to commence work immediately. These urgencies are reflecting actually already in the recent annual union work program. We've also launched calls already to start the implementation. And there we have also to mention that we've decided to create a high-level forum. The internal procedures within the Commission are actually already running for the Commission decision to create this high-level forum that would group member states, stakeholders in the future. Also to basically to help us identify priorities to come. We also announced the creation of a chief standardization officer within the Commission, which is basically to highlight and which coordinate the work of Commission services, but which also highlights the importance that that we give to standards and that we aim to give to standards in the future. Also, we will reap the potential of standards for our policies, starting with a review of harmonized standards to see how they deliver on the Green Deal, on the digital decade, and the resilience objectives. So that sort of screening we need to do whether standards that we've got today are fit for purpose or whether we need to further work on them. Second work stream, we want to fix the system. We all know that it's functioning, but it can be improved and it deserves improvement. We want a fair, a balanced, and an inclusive European standardization system. We already work with the 3 European standardization organizations, SENS, ENELEC, ETSI, in the framework of what we call the task force between the Commission and European standardization organizations, in order to improve the system as it works today. And I must say the atmosphere is very positive, and we're doing good progress, which allows me to think that within the next few weeks we will be able to announce the product and the way we want to work in the future in order to optimize the system. European standardization organizations have got a prominent role in our system. They are our privileged partners. We basically delegate to them basically a monopoly for producing harmonized standards in support of our policies and law. But in order for that privileged position to be justified, we must ensure that the system is inclusive, and that's what we have to work upon together. And we also to make sure that it works in the interest of the public good. We also, in the strategy, we also call on ESOs and European standardization organizations to look at their governance, to analyze if and how it can be modernized, particularly to increase inclusiveness, which is one of the unique features that make our European system shine. SENS, ENELEC, and ETSI, and the national standardization bodies have been invited to find ways to increase the involvement of SMEs, of civil society, and users in standard setting. So that's also a building site that we've got in front of it. Third work stream, our international footprint. We often are too late. We don't coordinate enough within the EU. We've realized that we're not always as strategic as we might hope. And the intention there is to work with all our partners on an international approach, leveraging our trade relationships with like-minded partners. Anthony is part of the panel. He can confirm that we're working quite well on the Trade Technology Council. We're doing good progress in working group 1 on standardization, but we also want to support standardization capabilities in Africa. We want also to address other like-minded partners and be more assertive when it comes to leadership positions in international standardization bodies, or like now, very opportune for internet protocols in ITU. Fourth work stream, our pre-normative work. Let's be frank, until now it's been neglected. When an innovative technology or product is being developed, we must think from the very beginning about standards, and this must be part of the work from the start. Here we came up with concrete ideas like a standardization booster or code practice for researchers within our research programs, at least the one the EU finances. So, and if there are additional ideas, good ideas, we're of course ready to look at them. Fifth work stream, and I'll stop with that. A topic that's often neglected: skills. Standards, basically, they only rest on the technical expertise of our standardization experts. And we're facing a generation shift. We need to bring our standardization population not only is very male, but it's also aging. So, I think we can work on both avenues. We need to bring standards into universities, into companies, and to show that there can be a career track for people who want to get interested in standards. So here we're proposing to hold EU University Days and dedicated outreach to potential future standardization experts, so that we actually mobilize our young people and that they see the interest and the value of standards. I'll stop there. I've been too long already, Martin, but I think that it was important that both to explain where we were coming from and what we plan to do. Just to finish, we basically have started to work on all these avenues. We've identified sort of 21 measures, 21 avenues. So I'm not saying that we started on 21 of them, but on many of them we started. So work in progress.
So yeah, thank you, Gwen. And as one of the aging standards professionals, I certainly can vouch that there is a career in standards, and encourage, you know, the education in our universities and schools, of course. I'm aware that the MEP Catharina is short of time, so I'm going to actually change the order a little bit and go straight to Catharina, and then I'll come back and do our Digital Europe response. So Catharina, please.
That's fine. Thank you, Martin, for your flexibility. Also, I know it's always a huge challenge to have so many great people and ideas coming together. First of all, thank you a lot for the invitation. I think it's a very important topic that we're discussing today. My first job after college was actually working for the European headquarters of Google in Dublin. So I can say that I've had my deep dive into the tech and digitalization session. You already mentioned it. I'm a member of the USA delegation. I'm also active in the INTA committee, so the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament. So what I would like to do today is give you a trade perspective, and in particular regarding the TTC that was already mentioned by Cecilia. And I think also Anthony will talk about that a bit more after me. As you know, during the past few years, we saw the EU and the US come together to solve long-standing issues in trade. Very happy about that. We also saw a clear political push towards a more constructive and ambitious cooperation. And I believe we only have like 2.5 years left from the EU side, from the mandate point of view, and also for the Biden administration. There is some end date, of course. So I think we really have to use this momentum also with regard to setting standards for AI and other emerging technologies. When we do this, we have to keep in mind that the EU and the US have the world's biggest trade and investment relationship with worth over $1 trillion per year. So together we account for about 1/3 of the world's trade and its standards. And as you all know, these figures do have an impact, and they show that the EU and the US can have a big influence on how things are done when we cooperate, and what we can have, and that we can have great leverage in global discussions. And I think that's precisely the importance of the TTC, and why we have to move forward during the next TTC Council in May. So I would like to urge all stakeholders involved in the TTC and going to Paris or to France in May to come with clear deliverables. First, to work on standards for ourselves, and second, to multilateralize these standards afterwards. I spoke to many of my American friends. I also spoke to the ambassador here in Brussels, Margita Stein, and I can really say that I feel that our US counterparts are super enthusiastic about the TTC. So much that they've even taken ownership of it, which I think is only a very positive sign, because that means that we have a good base to cooperate. So for myself, I'm trying to see before the summer if it would be possible for me personally to visit DC. So any suggestions from your side, I'm very open to it. You can also email my office afterwards. But I will also plan a visit to DC to discuss our differences, and I think we all should do that. And that differences, more specific, comes to the international data flows. And when we speak about AI, we should also understand that the digital market is a global market, and more than half of the global GDP is digital or is linked to it. As you know, no IA without data. And these are all the issues that should be priorities for the bilateral talks with the US, while at the same time continuing to protect the privacy of our citizens. With regard to AI and other emerging technologies, I fully agree that we should look for a common approach. We should lead by setting the standards, and with the political influence that the EU and the US have, we can steer global discussions, and the TTC has a clear task here. First of all, new rules should respect our democratic values. A human-centered approach should be used, and products should be interoperable with each other. I also believe that technical barriers should be removed, and that we need to work together with like-minded partners, as Cecilia already said, not only the US, that share the same values. As I said before, the EU and the US should have a good discussion about their differences in order to have fruitful outcome of the TTC. not only to contribute to our bilateral trade agreements, but also for our technological leadership globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Catharina. I think I'm going to let you off the hook and not ask you a question, because the question I was going to ask, I think you already answered. So just want to add that if you're visiting, please come visit us in Digital Europe sometime, because we're only just around the corner, as well as...
I will. We only met digitally, but we're practically neighbors. Exactly. I have good coffee here, but I heard that you also have good coffee. So yes, let's do that, Martin. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Catharina, and thank you for your time.
You're welcome. All the best.
Okay, thank you. So now I will just need to do a swap. So now I'll just take this opportunity to present a very high-level summary of our paper from Digital Europe. We submitted our response to the consultation to the Standardization Strategy. It's published on our website. I think somebody's going to put a link in the chat. There's a link on the slides there for future reference. We also participated in a joint statement from that included Business Europe, Orgalim, COSIR, APIA, and others. And I apologise for not listing all of the associations. And the joint paper is broadly aligned with the points that we've made, that we are making. So the first point, and this is probably hopefully reassurance that we fully support, Digital Europe and its members fully supports the new legislative framework as the system that supports the single market. The legislation, harmonized standards, and conformity and compliance are the holy trinity that glues the single market together. We think the approach does need ironing out. It's like a living, I think, Gwen sort of said, it's a living organism. It needs to adapt, it needs to change over the times. And it also needs to sort of be enhanced as we move to more digital oriented files and away from just physical products. But the underpinnings are there, it's really good, and it's used, and it's really effective. So for those that are not overly familiar with the system, I just want to sort of point out that we will be, you'll hear mentions of Regulation 1025/2012 throughout the webinar today. And this is the regulation that lays out the standards part of this trinity. So the new legislative framework is rooted in health and safety, so that products sold and distributed in the EU via the CE marking regime protect citizens and consumers, and harmonized standards developed by the ESOs permit the manufacture of goods with legal certainty. So these standards sort of, these are aimed at, stopping mobile phones from frying your brains, or, machinery from chopping your arms off, and construction materials that can hold up to the job. However, legislation and digitalization is not only about health and safety, but we also cover societal issues. Privacy, for example, with GDPR, accessibility to include people with disabilities, as well as other issues that arise when you move your life or your business online. Competition issues, lock-in issues, and there's a demand for interoperability and then portability between different providers. So in our view, the NLF must be suitable to support these type of issues and to support the upcoming legislation such as the AI and Data Acts. And the CE marking regime needs to cover these less tangible goods as well, or combinations of these, software and physical goods. That being said, we believe that the use of other instruments aside from harmonized standards, such as common technical specifications and certification schemes, are not really the right way to go, as these have limited stakeholder engagement and buy-in. Please let's focus on using harmonized standards as the vehicle for presumption of conformity for the operation of the single market and legal certainty. On our second point, and we firmly believe in open, voluntary, market-driven, consensus-based standards as the best way to facilitate international trade. Standards have to be developed in open venues with transparent processes, and consensus ensures the maximum buy-in. However, unless such standards are rooted in market realities of the customer and consumer demand and take into account the realities of cost of implementation in terms of time and money, they may not be the best vehicle to support legislation. Furthermore, if standards are too regional or too specific, or a choice may have to be made as to whether to enter or exit a particular market. This is why we believe that open voluntary standards should be developed as much as possible at the international level, or at the very least in close cooperation. This is the best approach for European businesses to operate on a global stage. Strong, with openness, we want strong stakeholder engagement, and that means anybody that has a stake in the game should be allowed to express their views along the whole life cycle of a standard. And from its inception stage, though its development review, including the inception, development review, and its adoption. That doesn't mean to say all stakeholders have a right to vote at each stage, nor they have veto powers, but views and opinions and advice should be solicited throughout. So we agree with the strategy about SMEs and civic engagement and request that all voices are solicited from start to finish. We do caution against governance changes in ETSI. I don't want to use this venue as to argue the rights and wrongs of whether the Commission can or should dictate governance models. Rather, we think that at a point where timeliness is extra important, the speed for delivery of standards is really, really important. Adding additional steps by inserting a new step to approve the start of a new standard could add significant delay, especially when member states already approved the standards request in the first place. There's been no impact assessment that we can see, and there could be some unintended consequences. So it's not. So we really think that the implications need to be thought through, and also, a piecemeal change to 1025 here, and also proposed in the General Product Safety Regulation, we think should be held off until there's a more general review of Regulation 1025. We also would like to see the preservation of the multi-stakeholder platform. The multi-stakeholder platform is a unique venue which brings together global standardization players, obviously with an emphasis on European players. Digital Europe's been a very active member since its inception, and we believe that Europe will be worse off for wear if it disappears. We hope it is preserved in some form or another, and for it not to be too much assimilated into a broader body with less focus. If you lose focus in ICT standardization issues, then stakeholders could lose interest, and it would weaken the community that we have already. We do advocate for increased competition between European standards organizations and international counterparts. We advocate for much stronger links between the international standards ISO, IEC, JTC1, ITU, and CENSA and ETSI. I'm not really going to say more than that. I think we just need to increase the flow of standards, or the transposition between either Europe to international to Europe, and even encourage more joint development of standards there, especially in the areas of AI. And then finally, and this point that Gwen pointed out, we do need more concrete actions to skill up and incentivize the stakeholders. I do want to call out there are already existing initiatives. We have digital skills, and Digital Europe is involved in a number of projects related to digital skills. We have the Stand ICT program, which the European Commission is funding experts to attend. And then the HS Booster has just been launched to support the strategy that Gwen mentioned with researchers to help research either bridge the gap or jump the chasm into standardization. We do believe, though, that more is needed to implant standardization in the mindset of C-level executives. So here's a good question. I mean, it's really good to see the Commission take the lead. So a rhetorical question here is, how many organizations, companies within Europe have a chief standards officer? So that's an interesting one. And I also wonder how many companies already also have a standardization department. So maybe let's examine how our corporates, and whether small or large, approach standardization and encourage them to have standardization departments and appoint chief standards officers as well. So that's a really brief overview, and I do urge you to go read our paper and the joint statement. I will now, since we've changed order a little bit, I'm now going to hand over to Anthony Quinn from the Department of Trade, who will give his views and opinions on the discussion today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on such an important topic, and great to be part of such a great panel of speakers. Maybe a special thank you to Gwen for being a wonderful co-partner in managing the TTC Working Group 1. It feels like we add more and more to our plates, and that's probably because the TTC is an important opportunity to fill some gaps in the technology standard space. I know Catharina mentioned the May ministerial, but I also want to take a moment to give a plug to the working group one stakeholder event that is taking place next week on May 6th. Registration closes today, I believe, but folks should still try to register for that. And it's going to be in person, and we will have a virtual option as well for stakeholders unable to travel. And a big thank you to the EU colleagues for doing the heavy lifting to organize the event in person in Brussels. Maybe I'll pivot a bit and dive into some of the TTC work that we're doing. And maybe I'll start with AI, artificial intelligence. The US and the EU, we both know that artificial intelligence technologies have the potential to bring significant benefits to our citizens and economies, and can help tackle significant challenges that we face and can improve the quality of lives. And for that reason, Working Group 1, Technology Standards Working Group, is developing approaches for coordination and cooperation in critical and emerging technology standards, in addition to a dedicated subgroup on artificial intelligence, which was established to advance work on specific deliverables and to ensure a coordinated approach, given AI's cuts across many of the Trade and Technology Council's working groups. Of course, for us, our goal in working on AI in the Tech Standards Working Group is to affirm the development implementation of AI systems that are innovative and trustworthy and that respect universal human rights and our shared democratic values. The EU and the US maintain that a risk-based approach to AI can enable trustworthy AI systems that enhance innovation, lower barriers to trade, bolster market competitiveness, and operationalize common values and protect the rights and dignities of our citizens. Our colleagues here in the US at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, released the first draft of an AI risk management framework, as well as a special publication on bias in AI. And let me say that the TTC is less than a year old, and much of our work is still in progress, right? I think as I'm reminded by colleagues from companies, the work on artificial intelligence has been happening for decades, and it feels very slow. And for better or for worse, some of the work that we're undertaking feels the same. So I think people have the anticipation that we're doing a lot more than we are, but we're having a lot of discussions, and I think we're making great progress, but there's still some work to be done. With that said, we are jointly exploring how to implement existing AI principles and related efforts within our respective jurisdictions and policy and regulatory landscapes. I think we have a mutual understanding on this topic, which will help lay the foundation of future cooperation on AI initiatives. I won't say much more about AI. I think with the May ministerial coming up and our principles, I don't want to overstep the announcements that they'll make on some of these, but I'll continue to say that we're in good shape, and I think that it's very encouraging where we are on this topic specifically. I also want to commend Gwen and his colleagues over at the EU for the release of the EU Standard Strategy. I'm sure this was a huge undertaking. As many of us know, the US is set to release a national standard strategy for critical and emerging technology, which will complement the current public-private sector strategy by which we currently operate. So we understand the challenges of releasing something so important, yet so robust as well. The EU Standard Strategy clearly expands the Commission's oversight of the European standards organizations and their standards development processes to ensure alignment of resulting standards with EU policy objectives. And it seems to place more boundaries on stakeholder participation in standards development work, particularly for non-EU stakeholders. The standard strategy will have a market impact on US access and ability to participate in organizations like ETSI, whose work on telecommunications and connectivity standards are essential to US and EU industry. I know our colleague, Mr. Weiler, will speak shortly as well and probably knows best about the impacts on ETSI of the strategy. But what I'm hearing from US stakeholders and what I believe is of great importance for the US to highlight is that non-EU stakeholders, although they will be able to join technical committees developing ETSI standards, they will be excluded from decision-making processes, including whether or not to pursue development of standards in areas. This is a crucial moment for the US and the EU. As standards work is begun, it can be difficult to stop. And we know that standards development needs strong industry and stakeholder engagement throughout the standards development process to ensure standards are technically sound, independent, and responsive to market needs. ETSI is unique, quite frankly, and part of the reason is some US industry are involved in ETSI is because the ability to support the US and the EU's shared ability to lead in the telecommunications space. When there was a move some time ago from the ITU by the private sector, ETSI was one of the places where they landed. And US companies make up about a 7% membership in ETSI. And I believe this is the kind of collaboration and standard setting bodies we should support. I believe it's the kind of work we've talked about and is important to the TTC work that we're doing, and it's complementary to that. Maybe finally, let me turn to the US government's national standard strategy for critical and emerging technology, which I mentioned earlier. Let me start by saying I do not have a publication date. We are very much in the process of working it through our government via the National Security Council and the interagency process. And I believe there will be a chance for input from stakeholders and quite possibly input from our colleagues and allies from around the world as well. The United States will continue to support open, voluntary, market-driven, consensus-based standards and advocate for greater cooperation amongst like-minded nations. So with that, let me talk about some of the technologies our strategy will focus on, and they probably come as no surprise. Advanced communications, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cyber, quantum, digital ledger, and energy technologies. I think it's a great opportunity for us in the US to do something very similar to what the EU is doing, to take a moment to shore up our system of standards development, but also to ensure collaboration and cooperation on some of the leading and most cutting edge technologies that are out there. So with that, I'll thank you and happy to answer any questions.
Hey, thank you, Anthony. And certainly news about a US strategy is very interesting. So, but we'll save questions to the Q&A, and I'll move on to the next one, who have been waiting patiently. So the next speaker is panelist is Dirk Weiler, who's the ETSI chair and also standards policy for Nokia. So Dirk, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me for this event, which I find very timely and also very well composed. Let me start talking about some basics of standardization, which from some speakers we have heard that already, but I think sometimes we tend to forget when talking about the use of standards for policy and regulation, what standards are in the first place. Standardization is a voluntary and industry-driven activity, mostly financed the whole system by industry. And also companies have invested billions of euros into the mobile communication standards, for example, and created this ecosystem. The the seamless mobile ecosystem from GSM over LTE and today 5G. And ETSI was and is at the center and the secretariat for this partnership project, the third generation partnership project, where we partner with SDOs from several other major economies, of course, including the US, but also China, Korea, Japan, and India. And we, as in ETSI, we at the same time, where we standardize globally, we are creating the corresponding needed European standards and harmonized European standards needed to support EU policies, and of course also for European market access of the related products. And here in ETSI, all stakeholders can participate, and indeed those who see the benefit to contribute are doing that flawlessly. And beside industry, both large and small, it's also academics, it's many European governments, and it's the societal stakeholders. And the fundamental method of decision-making in ETSI and in most standards bodies is consensus and not voting. And this is another element we need to take into account. Now, when I'm looking at and I can speak on that, I should say that not only as board chair of ETSI and head of standards policy in Nokia, but also having nearly 35 years of experience working in standards. Looking at the EU standardization strategy, of course, it contains a number of very positive elements, as recognized, I think, by most speakers, if not all. The idea of making standardization as a strategic element and not something only considered on a technical detail level is really good, and therefore also the nomination of a chief standards officer by the Commission is a very good element. But let me say, this strategic element of standardization has been the case for telecom industry since decades. You will, if you talk to my CEO, he perfectly knows what is standards and what is the value of standards. And that's why we're investing so much into standardization. And I would love to see this element also stronger used in other industries. Also, that to foster standardization for resilient green and digital European single market elements is for sure very good, because our industry of telecoms was already standardized for a long time, and therefore I can only support if standardization is used for all these elements. And of course, it's also absolutely right if we want to foster, if the strategy wants to foster technological sovereignty and protection of EU values. As such, this is a great idea, as well as supporting European industry and improving inclusiveness, and the elements of education about standardization. And here I can say ETSI has produced a lot of material for education. I can post the links into the chat. And we also have a seminar on teaching standardization coming up in October. Also, this link to research, what Gwen mentioned before, is important, but it's not that has not been there so far. It should be improved. But we have a strategy group looking on this interface between research and standards. And we have a long-term experience to work with EU-funded research programs to enable a better incorporation of research results into standards. So and as said, this putting standards high on the agenda with the chief standardization officer, also with the cross-sectoral high-level forum involving on a high level the whole European stakeholders into driving European standardization is really good and welcome measures. But at the same time, of course, the successful work of the European ICT standardization multi-stakeholder platform really should be continued. And in order to address the standardization needs of the EU in support of policy and regulation in areas like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, to name two most prominent ones. It was said somewhere, or maybe in the chat, that it's important to work together on with others and not doing things alone. And I can say that in Europe, the three European standardization organizations, so not only ETSI, but also our sister CEN and CENELEC, are already working very closely. We have modernized our rules for joint technical work, and our three boards have just approved the creation of a joint technical body for cybersecurity under the RED, so that we can start right away when the three ESOs will receive the corresponding standardization request. I can also say that we work very well together with the European Commission to see how we best can improve our way of working where needed, without losing the benefits of our system. And I think this balance is indeed, as Anthony already pointed out, is really something we carefully need to take into account both parts. Also ETSI has submitted detailed comments on the proposed changes of the regulation. And we are in the way to organize meetings with the Commission to discuss them in detail. And also, I would like to repeat what you said, Martin, the need for a thorough impact assessment before really making changes is really important. And I mean, as I have just yesterday evening, I have received the notification from the European Commission about the new initiative for an evaluation of Regulation 10/2025 with a call for evidence coming soon, public consultation and ETSI adoption planned next year. So it would make perfect sense to do this in one go. And I think I stop here and happy to discuss further.
Okay, thank you, Dirk. So I'll go straight over to Rebekka now, who's the Vice Chair of our Standards Working Group and also Director of Standards Policy in Intel. You're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of this event. Before I start sharing my perspectives, allow me to stress that the views that I will be sharing are my own and that they do not necessarily reflect the views of my employer or anybody else. With that being said, I, like the speakers before me, I very much welcome the publication of the Commission's EU strategy on standardization. And I welcome the emphasis that the strategy puts on standardization as a catalyst and enabler for the EU to create a resilient, green and digital EU single market. This is an inspiring message for the standardization community at large and for industry particularly. Standards are important means for industry to contribute to shaping that market. And the EU's vision for the single market holds lots of opportunities for companies operating in the EU, regardless of whether those companies are headquartered inside or outside of the EU. I believe, though, that the initial narrative around the strategy has led to some possible misunderstanding and concerns, especially with companies headquartered outside the EU. There has been the impression that the EU was moving away from the principle of open, voluntary, and market-driven standards and towards government control over standards development. I have also heard people say that the EU would henceforth view corporate interests as antagonistic to public interest. And there have been fears that the EU was going to exclude foreign headquartered companies from participating on equal footing in the European standards organizations, regardless of the substance of those companies' operations in the EU. In short, my impression is that a number of genuine stakeholders, at least initially, felt somewhat alienated by what they thought they heard in that narrative. I therefore very much appreciate the Commission's subsequent intensive engagement with stakeholders. Sophie Müller and her team have spent very significant amounts of time at events and in bilateral discussions to further explain the strategy, to listen to concerns, and to address misunderstandings. This has been enormously helpful because it has given stakeholders reason to constructively engage and to offer their support in designing the implementation of the actions announced in the strategy. And ultimately, those actions are what the strategy and its execution come down to. Obviously, it would be impossible for me to share thoughts on each one of those announced actions, but let me just pick out a few. One action that is very close to my heart is the action to work on concrete solutions and targets to accelerate the availability of harmonized standards in support of EU regulation. This one may sound somewhat less exciting than some of the other ones, but it is about what is perhaps the most important problem to fix. And if we do not manage to fix that problem, the ambitions behind a great number of the other actions are doomed to fail. The new legislative framework and harmonized standards are the most important and a very well-proven cornerstone of the European standardization system. It is not without reason that member state and industry inputs into the development of the standard strategy have primarily urged the Commission to address the practical issues that have of late been plaguing the operation of the NLF. There is no effective alternative to solving those issues. More specifically, I believe that it would be a fallacy to believe that greater use of common specifications could ever be an effective fallback solution. Firstly, common specifications will inherently always carry the risk of introducing technical barriers to trade, ultimately resulting in less choice and higher prices for EU consumers. Secondly, the time that may be saved by simply setting a common specification instead of allowing stakeholder consensus to emerge in a standards development process will normally not translate into an overall time saving. Rather, the lack of involvement of a breadth of stakeholders, including industry, risks severe implementation and market adoption issues. In worst case, lead to outdated technical requirements that result in product vulnerabilities. At Digital Europe, we have therefore observed the increasing provisioning for the possibility of deploying common specifications instead of relying on harmonized standards with great concern. I see a lot of merit in the now announced Commission action to develop clear criteria and processes for when and under which conditions this option should be used. But I strongly believe that those criteria should diligently constrain rather than expand the practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebekka. So last but not least, we have Jelle Hoedemaekers from Agoria.
Hello, thank you, Martin. So hello, indeed, everyone. I'm Jelle Hoedemaekers. I work for Agoria. And today I would like to, as the final speaker, maybe a bit of a different approach. As from Agoria, we are also managing the secretariat for certain standardization mirror committees. So very specifically, I handle the secretariat for the ISO IEC JTC1 SE42 on artificial intelligence, and as well the Sensenelec JTC 21. So you could say I'm quite hands deep in the daily operations around standards, so I'll try to bring you a bit this perspective. But next to that, and also a bit in that role as a secretariat, it's a bit my job to ensure that we have a broad community and a representative community on standardizations. And there I would like to highlight as well a bit the challenges that we're facing specifically around SMEs and their issues with standardization. So maybe looking towards and reacting on the standardization strategy, I can say that one of our main issues and concerns at the moment that we're facing is, as Rebekka already referenced it, the current issues around harmonizing standards. So in the past, and actually still at this moment, standardization is a very reliable and robust way for our companies to assure certain levels of quality, of safety, and then also, and more recently connected to the NLF, to comply to regulations. And the current situations with the lack of harmonization of standards, in reality, it creates a lot of uncertainty as really our stakeholders rely on these standards for compliance. And then of course you can make the argument that you don't necessarily have to use a standard. It can be done another way. But the reality, and that's more from an SME perspective, is for them, these standards are really key. As complying for them in their own way, without a standard for guidance, is often very difficult, time consuming. So from our point of view, this should be a priority in the future. Another comment that I would like to make is that for us, as Belgian companies, we see ourselves as part of a global market. And from that point of view, even though we fully agree that we need to have European leadership in standardization, we would often prefer still that standards first would be developed globally to avoid fragmentation. So from our point of view, we prefer to have, let's say, an international standard. Of course, if we would connect this to a European regulation, it has to pass a fit for purpose check. It has to be fit for the European market. Another focus, specifically from my experience working on AI standardization, it might even be broader than AI standardization, as I see this with a lot of new fast-moving technologies, is that these technologies are moving extremely fast, especially if you compare to the development cycles related to physical products. And I don't have the feeling that it's only a problem for the regulators, for example, to follow up, but also for the standardization world. Meaning is that, I think we all know that standardization and the consensus process, it requires some time, but actually there's a struggle to keep up. Meaning that we might at this moment start maybe working on a standard, and when it then would be published, there's already a risk that it's maybe outdated or maybe not relevant anymore. So I think what I want to say there, speed in the future will be key on standardizing new technologies, but we also need to ensure that we still have a robust consensus mechanism to ensure the relevance of these standards, which will be difficult. I'm quite I'm quite aware that this is not an easy challenge, but it's something that I wanted to highlight. Then specifically looking towards the proposal on an AI regulation, the AI Act, and there as well its implementation, it is our feeling that the success and the implementation of the AI Act will heavily rely on standards on artificial intelligence, and as well using harmonized standards there. What we're seeing is that there are already some standards which have been developed, which are existing, which could be usable, but I think I can say that the bulk still needs to be developed. And I think there is really a huge effort there. So maybe Martin, a bit of an apology, but as we have now quite a big forum, I really would like to push people here who are involved with artificial intelligence, get in contact with your national standardization body to see what is happening there and how you can be involved, as I think this will really be key if we want to achieve trustworthy artificial intelligence in Europe. This is maybe a final personal point of view. Being involved as in this work, I also see a certain risk that we fail to have enough technical experts developing all of this. Specifically, if I look towards AI and the companies in Belgium that are developing, let's say the high-end AI technologies, these are all startup scale-ups existing of young people. I didn't want to mention it. It was already referenced by someone else, but I think we can recognize that the standardization community is quite old, and there's a bit of a tension field. There's a bit of a tension field, I think, between the traditional standardization and also the open source community in which a lot of these startups and scale-ups operate. So I really want to push, but I think this is coming back in the standardization strategy as well, that we need to ensure that also young people are involved there. Other experts find their way to standardization, and education there is one major point we feel as well. But also other initiatives, it was already mentioned, like for example the Stand ICT project, which in a way tries to lower the barriers for participation, but still pushing startups and scale-ups towards AI standardization is very difficult, as they don't really see the added value at this moment. So we need to ensure that there's a better connection to be made. That was a bit my opening statement. Back to you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Jelle, and no problems. Call out for people to get engaged. If you don't like a standard, please jump in and help develop it. Right, that's always the call. Yeah, no comment on the age issue, but you're absolutely right. There has been a move from traditional standards writing or venues to more, even if it's just using open source tools as the authoring mechanisms. Okay, but we won't go into that debate today. So I think it's probably, before we actually go into some Q&A, it's probably good etiquette to let Gwen to respond to some of these speakers and some of the feedback from Digital Europe, and then we'll get into some serious Q&A.
Thank you, Martin. I will actually react on 5 elements. Try to be short. First one, EU, non-EU, because that seems to be a worry. The first thing I want to say is that we are not offensive, and although Anthony, for example, had some remarks, at the same time, we know perfectly well, both of us, that we work quite well as far as the international scene is concerned. I won't develop because those things are, I mean, we agreed among ourselves, but we'll leave our bosses to announce it. But I mean, I think there's excellent cooperation going on, which actually we don't plan to stop to an EU-US bilateral approach that we want to extend to like-minded countries. For me, the thing is that we're not offensive. Let's face it. On commission, on standards that are being developed on commission requests, we have our policy interest, we have our values, and we want them to be respected. Everybody is welcome to join the war. Frankly, the term throwing out non-EU companies, we all have to be reasonable. Nobody is talking about throwing out non-EU companies. Everybody is welcome to participate in war. But one has to understand that in a situation where the EU gives a sort of monopoly to 3 European standardization organizations to develop standards that would support our legislation, that would support our policy, there must be obligations going with it. And what we defend, the values, our objectives, has to be part of it. And as well as the US or China make sure that the integrity of their system is preserved, we want our system's integrity to be preserved. This being said, I heard about the impact of your business. I mean, I'm perfectly conscious that EU only represents 10% of ETSI business. Let's face it. So we are not demolishing Digital Europe's or ETSI's world. We're only saying for a 10% things where it's activated on the basis of commission request, we want certain values to be respected. Impact assessment. The question of impact assessment. Do you want to assess our principles? Because that's basically all we are about. We just want the integrity of our system to respect it. It's basically making sure that standards that are being developed on the basis of a commission request for Europeans are made by Europeans. Is that a question subject to impact assessment? Okay, I mean, I just want to draw your attention upon that because there are certain things that might not be subject to impact assessment. I close on that first point. Second point, government-led. The question, we're perfectly conscious that standards are developed by stakeholders. By the way, there's a reason why we ask for inclusiveness, not only by industry, by stakeholders. But we're perfectly conscious of this bottom-up led process. This being said, we also want to associate this bottom-up process better with the need to develop standards when we have processes. Anthony mentioned the US Standardization Strategy, quantum, he mentioned a few issues. We've got exactly I'm not saying we've got exactly the same priorities, but we've got also our priorities where we actually need standards to be developed. I'll give you an example. We developed an initiative on batteries a few years ago, the European Batteries Alliance. We brought all the stakeholders of the batteries ecosystem, if you want, or batteries value chain. And 2 years later, people realized, but we need standards. What we want to do is basically to bring standardizers early in the system so that basically the work we need as far as our policy objectives and the work standardizers do is better aligned. You might not have the problem as far as ICT is concerned, fine. If you're living in a happy, but the standardization strategy is not only directed to the ICT community. So that's basically something general. And it might be the case in ICT as well, but we definitely identified that as something we want to do, basically to preserve the bottom-up approach, but also to have a sort of top-down. And if you look at the EU the annual work program that we issued, it's basically there are our priorities, and we will need standards on them. It's not to tell you how the standards will look like. It's basically to say there it's clear that we will need standards. Third issue: standards versus common specifications. That's a good one. We don't dream developing common specifications in all fields. I mean, if you think we dream of that, and we are going basically to get rid of standards and we don't respect the NLF. By the way, on the NLF, Martin, because that was one of your interventions, on the NLF, let's face it, we've got NLF everywhere. I just want to recall there are two dimensions. There are certain elements where we don't have NLF in the sense you understand it. I would mention chemicals with REACH. I would mention medicines, where we've got an agency that approves medicine. Basically, logic, because it perhaps needs to be recalled. The logic is that we legislate according to the risk. So if a product needs pre-approval before it's put in the market, like a medicine, then you need to get the authorization of the European Medicines Agency first, EMA. And we want to legislate according to the proportionally to the risk. That's the philosophy. And NLF is excellent in the sense where you don't need pre-authorization, where you don't need to fix everything in the legislation. It's actually much better because industry knows it better. And we don't challenge that. We don't dream of doing it instead of you. And even if we were dreaming of doing it instead of you, we would not have the means to do it. That it's even more a comfort to you because there's no way the Commission could do that. Our problem is that as a public body, when things don't come, and I can give you a few. My favorite example is because it's one I have the privilege of been following it for the last 15 years. It's about 12 or 14 years we're waiting for a standard on equestrian helmets. It's nothing to do with your area, but put yourself in my shoes for a second. What should I do as a public body? Should I say, yeah, but no, I don't touch it because it's European Standardization Organizations should develop it. I've got a responsibility vis-a-vis the European citizen. I'm an EU official. I mean, I'm sorry, we're different things. Your industry, you've got ETSI who are standardizers. I'm a public official. I've got a responsibility vis-a-vis my citizens. They need a standard. They need a legislation that functions. And in that case, I need a fallback solution.
Gwen, sorry to interrupt. I don't disagree.
We don't dream of that. We basically, when it doesn't come enough, or it doesn't answer our public policy need, basically our regulatory need, we need a fallback solution. End of the story. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, end of the story. Therefore, we need to be able to develop technical specifications by the Commission when European standardization organizations don't deliver either in time or of quality that is good enough for our regulation.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting. We really do want to go to Q&A and hear from other people. So
okay, so just one thing, MSP, we recognize the value. It's just that it's been prolonged for 1 year, and we need to see the articulation with the high-level forum, but we do not challenge the value. And I just wanted to end, Martin, saying that I like your idea about pushing for chief standardization officers or standardization department companies.
Thank you. All right. Okay. So let's open the floor and get everybody here. And yes, I mean, it's obviously we could talk for hours. And if you can hang around, we can continue the discussion, the recording. If people have to drop off, that's fine. So I'm just trying to think. So I think just because we've got short time, I'm not necessarily going to go around and ask you the individual questions that I thought of. So maybe it can, and then there's probably respect to Q&A as well. So from the Q&A, there's a question here from Agata Hidalgo. How do you expect the standardization strategy to interact with the AI Act and the Data Act? So that's a very general question, and it covers a lot of the topics here. And I guess maybe Anthony, you might want to start and say how can the standard strategy, AI, and the TTC help a coordination? Sorry, put you on the spot there, whilst other people think of their answers.
No worries at all. I think that's a great point. I mean, Gwen and I are working diligently, and I don't know if he's seen the emails, but they're back and forth to finalize our annex for the May ministerial. One of the things I'll say is we're looking at the OECD principles, right, as a backbone for where we'll start some of this discussion. I think there's a lot of good work that's already being done that's out there, and I think that is a good starting point for us. I also believe that we have to involve industry more in this discussion as well. And I think we're getting closer to as we get closer to our stakeholder event next week, we have a panel specifically on emerging technologies. And I welcome people to intervene during that time to really offer their feedback and suggestions as well. So there are a number of things opportunities that will be forthcoming and have already transpired for participation and conversation with the stakeholders specifically.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else want to pick up on that question or respond?
Perhaps just to complete that, we're in constant contact with Anthony and colleagues on the US side. So I think that the day before the joint event, we'll have the opportunity to further discuss the topic.
Okay, so the next question, and building up from Jelle, I think in Belgium, 99% of companies are SMEs, right? So what actions are being taken, or do you want to see being taken to include SMEs and startups in the standard setting discussion, right? And that's at the policy level as well as at the sort of standards making level. Yeah,
but I think one of the major things here will be skills. And it's referenced, of course, but I think currently standardization is not being really taught in that many curricula anymore at universities. And traditionally, when it's taught, it's like in engineering courses, specifically on engineering standard. But more and more, I think this, from my point of view, has to be included. Yeah, of course, I like standards, so I would say in all courses, but specifically also in things like management courses, stuff like that, because they will quite surely be faced with standards. And the next for SME involvement is lowering the barriers. And I don't really have a very fit solution there, but it's maybe lowering the barriers financially. And convincing them that there will be a way that they can invest time now with a result later, because typically for a startup or scale up, they're looking towards the next month or the next 2 months. They cannot look forward 2 years. So we really need to find something to be able to have them participate in that sense and convince them that it's worth the effort to participate in standardization.
Very good. And just for Anthony's purpose, SMEs means mom and pop shops. So you'd quite use in the US. Dirk, so what about ETSI and SMEs and other stakeholder engagements?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a few answers to that. One is you can, of course, bring the horse to the water, but you cannot make it drink. So you can offer the possibility and lower the barrier to participate to standards. You can work on, as Jelle said, and as I have mentioned before, you can you need to educate people that standards are indeed an excellent tool to reach certain goals. But at the end of the day, a startup is also a business-driven company. They don't do that for the good of mankind, but their business case must pay out. Go spend their scarce resources to go to standards, participate there, and understand this is worthwhile for me, otherwise it will not happen. So all we can do is to share the information, to encourage people to do that, to teach them, but at the end of the day, they need to do it. And there are limits. I don't believe that paying a startup person to go to a standards body will really work out, because the money you can pay is very little. It's their time, it's their, either he does standards or he does something else in the interest of his startup. So unless we can convince him it's good for him, that will not happen.
I don't mean pay them to write standards. I mean, do things to lower the barriers. And like currently, let's say for participating, lowering the fee, or participating to certain plenary plenary sessions, stuff like that. Maybe one final point I'd like to add there, but this is maybe a bit controversial, but as I mentioned it already, open source. And so this is what these startups live and breathe. And so we need to think of a way to make a better connection as well, I think, between the traditional standardization and the open source community. Again, I don't have an answer there on how to do it, but I think that will be key in trying to collaborate these two, maybe now separate ecosystems together in the future.
Yeah, Anthony, I don't know if you want to speak on SMEs. I then want to pivot to a slightly different question, but related to what Jelle just talked about.
No, I can just say that we have the same challenge here in the US when it comes to SME involvement and standardization. I know the virtual world has definitely helped, right? It's highlighted an opportunity for us to involve SMEs and non-traditional companies in the broader sense. So I think we probably need to ensure the hybrid model continues to be successful and utilized throughout the standardization process.
So thank you. So I'm going to ask Rebekka, the MSP, you've been involved since, I think, its inception. How valuable do you think it is, and how valuable do you think the contribution of like fora consortia or the standards organizations, and maybe in the future even open source communities, play into this strategy? Because up till now, we've only really talked about the formal standards bodies.
Thank you. So listening to what Gwen said a little earlier, and also listening to other contributions at more recent events, I think there seems to be consensus that the MSP has been enormously successful, and that there is value in at least considering what and how possibly to continue it in relation with the future high-level forum. I very much support that approach. I believe that a structure like the MSP is needed to execute on the EU standard strategy. Probably the most important thing that the MSP has achieved is that it has succeeded in bringing all relevant stakeholders in the ICT standardization ecosystem together in support of EU policy objectives. And it is done so before, I mean, years and years before the EU standard strategy that now came out stressed so much the importance of standards for EU policies. So that was in a way visionary. this is also an especially important achievement because the global ICT standardization ecosystem specifically is very complex and very highly diversified. Unlike in other sectors, there are these very well-established global fora and consortia that play a major role in that ecosystem. Today, it is impossible to build state-of-the-art ICT equipment without using the standards developed by these organizations, whether it's the IEEE, W3C, you name them. There are many of them, and they are important, and they have their very specific expertise. So without tapping into the expertise of these groups as well, in developing new standards and in including them in what are priority areas for the EU, I think that we will not be successful with the EU strategy. And the MSP has been successful and effective precisely because it has included and leveraged the expertise of those global perspectives as well. And I think that is probably the key question that we need to ask ourselves and need to, the key fact that we need to realize as we discuss continuation of the MSP and its future relation to the high-level forum. But I think it would not make sense and to be that it would be highly inefficient to not renew the MSP and then to embark on reinventing it. It always takes time to make stakeholder networks operational and effective. And I would see very little point in changing what I regard a winning team.
Okay, does anybody else want to make a comment on the MSP or consortia type standards? I mean, I for one, you know, I think you're right. There is a challenge ahead in the consortia fora space for, you know, open source, and that's really where the technical guys are at the moment, and deriving. We have seen, you know, standard or sort of technical specifications being derived from open source, API specification, etc. Again, you know, it's the end result is a document, whether it's online or not, that multiple vendors can, you know, other vendors can implement. That's really the nature of consortium fora standards, whether they're developed, you know, sitting in a room with a whiteboard or using open source tools, or, you know, code first, document first, you know, second, or vice versa. Actually doesn't really. It's sort of some sort of hybrid that we've got to figure out. So just adding my 2 cents. I think we are actually at the end. So apologies, we cannot go through some of the questions in the Q&A. I really do apologize for that. But I hope you do find that this event has been truly useful. I mean, hearing about a US strategy, I think it'd be very nice once that's known that we engage in a dialogue and compare the US and the EU strategies. We have the TTC coming up, the Work Group 1 stakeholder meeting next week, which I think is going to be very interesting. So I would like to thank the panelists for their time. Sorry, wasting some of that time. I think we can all agree it's been a very useful or enlightening discussion today. Thank you to the audience. We had over sort of 300 attendees. Please do read the Digital Europe papers and the joint statement. With Digital Europe, we talk about these standards policy issues in the Standards and Interoperability Working Group. So if you're a Digital Europe member, please come along. If you're not a Digital Europe member, why not? Please join. Finally, this is the second event of our digital deep dive series. The next one in a few weeks' time will be on digital skills, which is timely, we've just talked about. Please look out for details on the website. I would like to thank you to Jocke Mistian, who's the secretariat for the S&I group. And I'd also like to thank our comms team for helping put this webinar together and making sure it runs on time, particularly to Tom McClure, who's been driving all the slides and the Zoom in the background. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of the week, and contemplate what your favorite standard is. So with that, I will close. Thank you.